Hey there, Colts fans. This is Nathan Brown, your Colts insider with the Indianapolis Star, here with Joel A. Erickson. We are in separate spots inside the convention center downtown. It is, of course, NFL Combine Week here all across downtown Indianapolis. We've just had a couple days of interviews. We start to see guys on the field going through workouts tomorrow, but the big part of this week that we will dive into here for Colts fans and folks curious about this team in particular. This week really revolved in lots of ways around getting a chance to talk to General Manager Chris Ballard and head coach Shane Steichen, who, outside of my couple-minute chat with Coach Steichen up at Trine a couple weeks ago, we had not heard from since the week after the end of the regular season. A lot has changed. We are getting close to the opening of free agency. We are in the franchise tag window, which is big for a couple of players, Nathan Jones and Alec Pierce, of course. So this is the time where the makings and the foundation of this roster is being put back together, and will come together really potentially, as soon as over the next couple days, if the Colts do use that tag, or if nothing else, over the next couple weeks as free agency opens for legal tampering on March 9th and then for real on March 11th. So we got a chance to talk to both Shane and Chris in a couple different settings yesterday afternoon. Learned a lot from both of them about where they see this roster, what they feel like needs to be different. But the big starting point for both of them was figuring out a way for this organization to hang on to and sign long-term deals, hopefully with quarterback Daniel Jones and wide receiver Alec Pierce. Joel, you've written a lot about both of those guys and how they are interconnected and how their fates really make this foundation for what this 2026 Colts team can be. What were your biggest takeaways from talking to both of them yesterday?
Yeah, I think one of the things about the Combine is that, everyone always says, at the Combine, everyone's trying to kind of obscure their attentions. It's actually kind of sets this table, and I think that Colts fans know that, this isn't I know any time you bring up Chris Ballard's name, you want to talk about the big picture here, but this isn't a comment on the way he handles his job. This is the way, this is a comment on, the results. This is a comment on, what you can expect from this week, but he usually gives you a pretty good sense of what the offseason is going to look like. And I thought it was pretty point blank yesterday, because he said, the priority is you re-sign Daniel Jones and Alec. Those are I think he said there's a big part of that, and you just kind of go from there. And then I thought there were some other hints that we can kind of get into down the road, but I think they're going to sign a defensive end would be one of my big takeaways. They need to overhaul that. And then I think the draft, you guys kind of knew this already, and we knew this already, but it's the front seven. It's young defensive tackles behind, maybe one young defensive tackle, really, because he likes Adetomo at Barre. But then it's defensive end overhaul, linebacker overhaul. And that kind of sets the tone for what you're going to do. But the reason it starts with Jones and Pierce, and I think there's been some, confusion. I don't know if some people just kind of went back to their priors on Jones. There's just not really another option. But beyond that, someone could say, well, you could trade for Tua Tagovailoa. Well, if you're concerned with Jones is injuries, well, I have bad news about Tua Tagovailoa. He is not the healthiest individual in terms of staying healthy. But also, I think it's probably an underestimate of, and I think this is the case with, a lot of people. They never got over their priors on Daniel Jones. They still think of him as the quarterback who didn't work out in New York. They don't really, they discount what he did during the season. I know there are some people who still talk about, it felt like it was starting to get worse there in terms of how he's performing even before the injury. And they think that, but the Colts don't feel that way. And I don't know. One of the things that's hard for us is we don't know what it's going to look like. But I can tell you this: the Colts don't feel that way. The Colts feel like he's the important piece. He's a perfect partner for Shane Steichen, and they feel like they have to have him. So he's going to be here, one way or the other. He's going to be here, and because he's here, that probably means Alec Pierce is going to be here. And I got a lot of weird blowback over something that Alec Pierce said on video back when it happened. But Pierce said that if they get Jones back, it goes a long way towards getting Pierce back. And that's true. Everything I've heard here, while wandering around the convention center and around Indianapolis and talking to people, is that those two are very, very close. They played golf all last summer. They know each other very well. And Pierce wants to play with Daniel Jones.
I thought it's something I think I had written earlier this offseason, but I thought Greg Doyle, or a colleague sports columnist for the Indy Star, put it really well in a column that he wrote today about how if the Colts do in fact have to make a decision between the two, that ultimately you have to go with Daniel Jones. You can make arguments about his reliability as a quarterback, and whether he is worth the tens of millions of dollars that the Colts are going to have to pay him on a long-term deal, or even more than that on a franchise tag. But when you look at the market at quarterback here in the NFL this offseason, there is no one else. There is Daniel Jones. There is Malik Willis, who has shined in sparing moments as a backup quarterback in Green Bay over the last couple of years. In a system that was, I think, in those appearances that we've seen, like tailored for him to have success. But I don't think that comes with a body of work that you would feel comfortable paying him, upwards of $30 million, as I think was reported today in a couple different places that he is likely to field this offseason. There just aren't good options. And if you want to compete next year, and this is a roster that if it retools its defense, re-signs Alec Pierce, this is a team that I do think, as we saw in the first 10 games last year, is ready to compete. It is not a team yet that is ready to bottom out and completely restart. So giving up on Daniel Jones and either handing the reins over to Riley Leonard for as well as he performed in the season finale that included essentially one half against the starters on the Texans defense. You could hand the team to Riley. You could see what that looks like. But I don't think he's your long-term fix at quarterback, even if you gave up on Daniel Jones anyways. And there just aren't other options out there. So unless you just want to upload this, which I know there are some fans out there that certainly would love to have seen Chris Ballard exit stage left and do a complete rebuild. Like it or not, that's just not happening this year. And so if the rest of the roster is poised to compete, you just can't afford to not have Daniel Jones back on this team. So we'll see if that comes via the franchise tag, which is somewhere around just barely north of $47 million for next season, or if that's a long-term deal where, with an average annual value that falls somewhere in the $30 to $35 million range. We'll learn that over the next potentially a couple days or even a couple weeks here as free agency begins to open. You were talking a little bit more about how close those two guys are and how pivotal they are. How do you see, when you look at the franchise tag situation, the amount of money that they are likely to field if they got to the open market and some of the potential suitors out there? How do you see those two guys and their fates in Indianapolis in some ways intertwined, and how that might work out?
Yeah, I don't really think I'd be really surprised if Daniel Jones signs in Indianapolis and Alec Pierce doesn't then sign. The Colts have already signaled a willingness. Chris Ballard has already signaled a willingness to move other players if he has to. If you go listen to us, if you listen to what our friends Kevin Bowen and James Boyd did in an interview with him today, he wouldn't commit to bring back, like, say, Zaire Franklin, who could get you some extra money. There's some other spots like that these two are the priority. I mean, I think I don't think the Colts see it as a one or the other. I don't think they think they're going to get in that situation. I do think that the numbers, especially on Pierce, may surprise some people. I think there's a chance that he signs for $28-29 million. But also, one of the other things to know is he's the best receiver in the market if he gets there. And the other thing is he can do something that very few receivers can do in the NFL. I think there are some people who look at his catch numbers, 37 catches, 47 catches. They think, well, is he worth that? Well, number one, top receivers now are getting 45. But number two, this is a league where every defense is predicated on taking away the deep ball. And for 4 years now, everyone in the league has known that the Colts want to get out Pierce deep, and he can still do it. And that's such a valuable commodity, especially to teams that were in the playoffs last year. That were like I've talked to some people who, and it's come up on teleconferences too. But like I've talked to some people who are like, New England would like to have that guy. The Chiefs have spent 4 or 5 draft picks or something like that, or 3 draft picks, and signing Marquez Valdez-Scantling. They've made trade. They've been trying to find that guy for a long time. That's kind of who Xavier Worthy was supposed to be for them. The Buffalo doesn't have a receiver, I don't think. I mean, I'm sure there's people on their roster, but they don't really think these are teams that will pay and can pay for him, and that's going to drives up the market, that drives up the price. Daniel Jones, I still think the comp is probably some version of what Baker Mayfield and Sam Darnold got. Maybe he gets more because of cap situation. I don't know. I don't know that the Colts are going to be able to pull off what Ballard said and sign both of them before the tag deadline next week. I think it's possible that they sign one and tag the other, and then work towards a long-term deal after that. If he does pull it off, I do think it'll be at pretty high. If he does pull off signing both of them, it'll be at pretty high numbers.
Yeah, it's a good reminder to folks listening here that just because you hear that the Colts have used the franchise tag on one of these 2 players, that does not mean that they are going to be playing at that number. The non-exclusive franchise tag that essentially gives the Colts, let's see, do some math here in my head, it gives them close to, or actually just slightly over 4 months to work out a long-term deal before that tag would need to be signed. I believe the deadline for that is in the middle of July. So using a tag does not mean that the player will play on it. It's actually fairly rare from history over the last several years. You will probably hear, although I think only a couple players got it last year, it's somewhere in the 6 to 10 range, typically, outside of last year as a bit of an outlier in terms of players that are tagged. But then typically you will only see a couple players actually play on it, because it gives those teams and the player and their agent a chance to work out a long-term deal. That non-exclusive tag then means that if another team outside the Colts could swoop in and give an offer to whichever player they might tag. But if memory serves me right, if on that non-exclusive tag, I think the Colts essentially get right of first refusal, and then is it 2 first-round picks that they would get if they opt not to match that offer? I think that sounds right.
Yeah, that's great.
So in all intents and purposes, Alec Pierce is not going to, or maybe he would, I guess, depending on how valuable you see him on the market. 2 first-round picks would be a pretty high price, although we did see Sauce Gardner get that and a little bit more. But it would still be a very steep price, and all the Colts would have to do to block it would be to match whatever he would get on the market. So it seems like these are 2 guys that are motivated to be in Indianapolis. They like the coaching staff here. They like working with each other. As you mentioned earlier, they've become very fast and close friends on and off the field. And I wanted to touch real briefly on that cap figure for Alec Pierce. You mentioned somewhere in the $27-28 million range. That sounds like a lot, because we're just not used to, up until the last couple of years, thinking of receivers making that much money. But that would fall in line with someone like Terry McLaurin of the Commanders. T. Higgins, the number 2 receiver on the Bengals, his average annual value of his deal right now is at $28.75 million. That doesn't seem all that outrageous when you actually look at what the market is right now. It would essentially be somewhere right around, a 10th most expensive contract in terms of average annual value in the league right now. And when you look at what Alec Pierce can do for you in a way that no one has done it in the league over the last couple of years, he's led the league in average yards per catch. It's just, as you mentioned, such a valuable commodity. And you have to think with a full year of health from him and a full year with Daniel Jones under center, the yardage and the catch numbers there will only get larger, probably in the 50 to 60 range. And then you're wondering how many touchdowns he produces and what the yards you get to there are.
Well, I mean, it's the law of supply and demand, right? You have not very many receivers available. You do in the draft, but you really don't. What you really don't have is receivers that can get deep whenever they want. That's the hardest thing to replicate. That's why Pierce is so valuable, and that's why he's going to have a bigger market than really maybe anybody thought a year ago. But that's the other thing is you're going to get to that spot. And so if you want to have Pierce, I think the other thing is if you take Pierce away from this offense, it's going to be really, really difficult to replicate the explosiveness immediately. And this is a team that, Carly Ursay-Gordon said the urgency is high, right? It's a higher sense of urgency, which that's her way of saying, they need to get into the playoffs. They need to show that they can do this for a full season. So, like you said, this is not a team that is playing in a way where they're fine just kind of treading water for a little while. They've got to play well, and the explosive element to the offense is so important that, like I said, they're gonna pay up.
Yeah, I mean, you've got someone at the running back position in Jonathan Taylor that you've heavily invested in, who's kind of in the prime of his career. We saw in the back end of this past regular season how, even if you have a solid offensive line and a guy like Jonathan Taylor, as that passing game becomes a little bit less effective when Daniel Jones was hurt and then out, it just became that much more difficult to run the ball, and the whole thing kind of falls apart. These two players, Alec Pierce, who can stretch the field, and Daniel Jones, who can distribute the ball and make some plays with his legs occasionally, and who in those first 10 games, maybe excluding that bit of an outlier game in Pittsburgh, I would say, where he had 5 turnovers. He was accurate. He was producing a lot of yardage. He was throwing very few interceptions. He was taking care of the ball, taking very few sacks. I know there maybe are some bones to be picked on the strength of their schedule in those first 2 games, but they played a couple playoff caliber teams. They played the Rams. They played the Broncos. They played the Chargers. They faced the Steelers, who, again, they did admittedly struggle against. They played Falcons, who came on pretty strong late in the season. This wasn't a true 10 easy games, cupcake type schedule, and they were head and shoulders the best defense in the league. And so much of that comes down to and Alec Pierce. Some of the maybe the ability to try and hold on to both of them in the form of much larger deals comes with, as you mentioned earlier in the pod, the potential parting with veteran players who technically still are under contract with the Colts, or opting not to re-sign veterans who are going to be free agents once we get to March as the calendar turns the page. Names that I think of off the top of my head, guys who are under contract: Zaire Franklin, Michael Pittman Jr., players who are going to be free agents: Braden Smith, Nick Cross, who is becoming a free agent for the first time in his career. Where do you want to start on how the rest of this roster maybe starts to fall into place? Let's presume that the Colts back both Daniel Jones and Alec Pierce, but maybe have to make some sacrifices in order to be able to do that?
Well, I think, one of the obvious places is linebacker. They talked about get it in that Zaire Franklin because you're talking about you have they want to get younger and faster on defense. Well, and Chris Ballard narrowed it even down even further. He wants to get younger and faster in the front seven defensively. Well, defensive tackle is not where you get faster. You could get more explosive there, but it's not really a position where you get faster and you run people down. Defensive end, even to some degree, is not the same type of thing. Like those defensive line positions are explosive plays. It's the same thing as what I just said about defensive tackle. It's explosive. It's not necessarily a position that you make your defense a ton faster. You can make it more explosive. Linebacker is a spot where you get faster. And I thought about this yesterday. I asked the question to Chris Ballard about, you guys talked a lot about keep taking linebackers off the field, not playing them, playing defensive backs. And I said, when it came right down to it, you guys did end up playing linebackers a lot. And he said, well, Hunter Wohler was out. But it made me think about it. He didn't say this, but it made me think about in that Arizona game when they wanted a spy who could run with Kyler Murray, they had to go to Ashton Doolin. They didn't trust either of their linebackers to be able to do that. And to me, that is a sign of what the team thinks of its linebackers in terms of their speed, their ability to play in space. They're going to have to add people there. I think the draft is obviously a place to do it. This is a deep linebacker class, unlike last year's. But if you want to make this defense faster, maybe it's both guys. Jermaine Pratt's a free agent. Maybe you don't want to go in with two young guys. But the flip side of that is maybe you do. Maybe you just want that speed. And you don't want to have to count on if you lose a young safety like that. Especially, with maybe having to move on from Nick Cross.
Yeah, it's a great point. Chris, he mentioned Hunter. He mentioned Jalen Carlisle, both players at that linebacker position that succumbed to injuries this past season, and we didn't see. Again, those are young guys who have yet to reach their potential and have already missed considerable time. But those are options, young, physical, speedy options at that linebacker position that the Colts could maybe feel out a little bit coming into training camp. Certainly, those aren't going to be the only two guys that you have on the roster, but maybe if you have those guys, maybe you sign another veteran that's not Jermaine Pratt. Maybe you cut ties with Zaire Franklin, who I believe would save the Colts right around $5.7 million in cap space if they did cut him this offseason. There are ways where you can save several $1 million working around there. Nick Cross, as you mentioned, free agent at that safety spot. Chris Ballard, I think this was maybe one of the most poignant moments of that interview that Ballard had with Kevin Bowen and James Boyd on the Fan Morning Show earlier this morning on Wednesday. He was asked about Nick Cross and whether he felt like the organization could afford to keep him, and he said that he pointed out how young Cross was when he was drafted. He was 20 years old. Ballard readily admitted that Cross was not ready for the role that the Colts drafted and slotted him into as a guy who has appeared in all of one game, in everything but one game in his 4 years with the Colts as a third-round draft pick. He started every single game each of the last 2 years, and he could not praise Nick Cross enough about how he has matured both on and off the field, how he has developed into a guy that is every bit deserving of a second contract. Yet, when you look at the price it's likely going to take to hold on to him, and you start to think about the money that they're going to need to probably sign a veteran impact player at defensive end, and Daniel Jones and Alec Pearson. It's you're not going to be able to hold on to everyone. And Nick Cross feels like the type of player that, if for whatever reason his market is a little soft and a little cold when we get to free agency, that I'm sure the Colts would love to resign. But I wrote a story right before we hopped on the pod here, looking through those quotes that Chris had earlier this morning, and then looking at some stats on the money that safety free agents made a year ago. And I think that the top 5 were all making or got deals with worth at least $10 million per year. The top 7 were above, I think, $8 million a year. And when you look at what Cross was making this year, I think his base salary was right around $3.4 million. He was $3.6 million against the cap. Say pay him $8 or $10 million. That's eaten up a good chunk of the $35 million in cap space that you have right now. Of course, they're going to be able to create some more of that, whether that's restructuring guys or parting ways with them. But he's unfortunately not a guy that I think is high on the priority list when you look at the positions that they need to sign. And I think that's also a position at safety where you could potentially find someone in that 3rd, 4th round range, and hopefully find a way to be able to rely on it. Now, I don't know that maybe you're drafting an every game starter as a rookie at safety, but maybe you kind of go back to the drawing board and try to find someone like a Nick Cross that you can rely on, who would be relatively cheap over the next 4 years, and just hope that you can strike gold again at that spot and find a way to maybe take some blows early on in that young player's career, but get a lot more inexpensive and save some money there when you're going to spend it elsewhere.
Yeah, I thought Ballard's comments on Nick Cross were the kind of thing that he says when he's preparing to lose a player. Mm-hmm. He talked about, he's told this story before about, or this anecdote before about how when the players are rookies, he brings them in and he says, at some point you and I are going to disagree on money, and that's fine, and it doesn't change anything. And if you get paid more than somewhere else, that's the kind of stuff he says. I think it's the kind of stuff he said about Will Fries last year before he got signed. That's usually an indicator that he doesn't necessarily think that the players could be back.
It just feels like he's like laying down breadcrumbs a little bit. He's not saying definitively the Cross is not coming back, but he's almost kind of preparing the fan base, laying the groundwork for that to possibly happen. And again, when you look at the landscape, that seems like a pretty good likelihood, I think.
I think the other thing is, you mentioned this and I've mentioned it, but this is maybe a piece to get into. They're going to sign a defensive end. I don't think it's an accident that he mentioned and brought up guys like Jabal Sheard, Dadiq Autry, in a question about, can you just go young at some of these places? I don't think, he mentioned that defensive end needs an overhaul. I might have led him into that. I think I might have asked the question in a leading manner, which I try not to do, but he agreed with me. He didn't push back on it, but they need to get better at defensive end. My understanding from talking to people is that the Colts are backing that up in meeting rooms right now, that they're telling people if they want to sign a defensive end, they have to. I think that's the other thing, is they have to. You look at, they still believe in Latu. They believe that he can take the next step, but they don't know for sure that's going to happen. And they can't have what happened this year after you lost Buckner, where their pass rush essentially evaporated without him. They had 26 sacks in 8 games with a healthy Buckner. After his neck injury, now he did play in one of those games, but he wasn't himself because he immediately went back on IR and had surgery. They had 13 and 9, and the pressure numbers fell off. Everything fell off without him, and so they know that, and they know that they can't survive like that, going forward. I think one of the keys to this what Shane Steichen said is we've got to be able to win ugly with your defense. And you win ugly when you close. And there were games like the Seahawks game where they had a lead with 40 seconds left, and all they needed was someone to get to Sam Darnold and make him throw errantly a couple times. They couldn't do it. So that's kind of, they're going to have to sign one. There's a lot actually on the market. I know Trey Hendrickson is the obvious fit based on playing in Anarumo's defense, but there's a lot of guys out there who you could sign that could help, and some of the guys that kind of fit that end of the rookie contract. Maybe there's more to them than their stats say. That like Odafe Boye Mafe, Jalen Phillips maybe is too much. He's probably a little bit higher in the total poll, but there's a lot of guys there, and that's gonna be the splash. They're gonna sign one.
Yeah, that I asked him the question. I think I was maybe kind of following in line with some things that you had asked him in our second chance to chat with Chris yesterday, and I asked him. I wanted to make sure I didn't feel like I needed to ask specifically, a question like, are you guys in the market for Trey Hendrickson? Because he's not necessarily going to be able to give us truly an honest answer, and I don't know what all you gain from that. But I asked him, do you see yourself in a market for one of these big name defensive ends? And he said,
Yep.
Clearly yes. And I think this defense, when Latu is able to be a developmental guy who doesn't have to be relied on to be the playmaker, at least at this point in his career, I think that changes everything so much. I mean, when you imagine the upgrade going from Kwity Paye, who was great in certain circumstances, but is just proven over the course of his career, also another guy who's a free agent, who I would imagine is not back in Indianapolis next year. You mentioned a couple of them there that you rattled off, whether it's a young guy coming into free agency for the first time, whether it's a veteran that you maybe roll the dice a little bit on. Trey Hendrickson maybe doesn't quite, he's kind of maybe in his own category. He is either 30 or above, and he's also had some injury issues over the last couple of years, and also seems like he's going to cost a pretty penny. So I don't know if that, when you're paying what you're going to have to pay to Pierce and Daniel Jones, I don't know if he makes the most sense, but there does seem like a guy that'd be a significant upgrade compared to Kwity Paye that I would have to think would fit in the Colts price point. And I think you can also then maybe draft someone either with that second round pick that you have, or something in the third or fourth, or maybe you drop back a couple spots and pick up even another pick inside the top 100. I think this could also be a great year where you draft someone who doesn't have to be relied upon immediately and who can have a chance to develop, which is something that Latu didn't really have the opportunity to, because when you draft someone first, in the first round as the first defensive player taken, that player is going to kind of be expected to get those snaps right away. And that's just not an easy position to be able to have an immediate impact. But I think there could be a great opportunity, again, if they hit on the right guy in the second or third round, to get a guy who could develop and mold over the next year or two behind a veteran, or maybe they're behind Latu, and maybe you have to decide in a couple of years whether you want to hold on to Latu or not. That could be a great place, or a great way where you could add depth, because this is a position where I think they're set to potentially lose. Is it 3 or 4 defensive ends in free agency? So you're not going to just be able to draft someone or just get someone in free agency. You have a lot of holes there to fill, because as Chris Ballard has said, this is a team that can't just rely and pick up stars. It needs to be a team that, if and when injuries come, you have depth that can fill holes and not have your team completely fall apart. Kind of like DeForest Buckner's loss in the middle of last season. Quarterback is a little bit different animal, but you need to be able to afford to lose someone like Buckner or like Sauce Gardner or Trevarius Ward, and not just have your defense completely fall apart.
Yeah, and the corner position is an interesting one to discuss there too, because obviously they lost those two guys. Their corners didn't. They were down to like the sixth and seventh, or however you order the corners. They were down to the bottom of that barrel. But towards the end of the season, there, if you have Jalen Jones out there, if you actually have pass rush, they had so little pass rush down the stretch. If you have that, those guys play better. They just do. And not having any pass rush with those guys healthy, I think is something that really sticks out from last season. And it's really like last season they overhauled the defensive backs, but this season you've got to overhaul the edge rush and you've got to overhaul linebacker. Going back to this is really quick. I didn't say anything earlier, but I don't really think Ballard mentioned Jalen Carlisle, but I don't really think they're counting on him. And I think the reason I say that is that's the kind of same stuff he was saying about Juju Brents last year, about the injuries. And that means like 2 years of full injuries for a player who hasn't played much. We're at the point now with Carlisle where, yes, they are open to him. They want to see him play. But if he gets hurt again, I think there's a chance he's not back at all. Yeah. Or I shouldn't say not back at all, but not here at the end of training camp.
Yep, that's a great point. Other topics that we want to hit on before we wrap up here. Some quick injury notes. Chris got asked about both DeForest Buckner, who, of course, had surgery on the pinched nerve in his neck, the herniated disc that kept him out of all but one of the final 8 games of the year. He said that after going through that surgery that Buckner felt a bunch of relief, not only just the physical relief that comes with that, but that mental and emotional relief of feeling like his body was going to be in a position where he could play football again. You wouldn't put a timeline on it specifically, but there are no issues or questions as to whether Buckner will be back and ready for next season. He also wouldn't give any sort of a concrete update on where Daniel Jones was in his rehab from his torn right Achilles tendon, but noted that he's eager. He's attacking it in every way you possibly could. He's probably going to have to be held back in some ways by the organization and the coaches just to make sure that he's taking enough time to get this fully ready and fully healed. But Jones told us at the end of the season when we spoke to him that he expected to be ready by training camp, and I haven't heard anything that would make me think otherwise at this point, although that does seem, when you start to think about it, pretty quick. That would amount to about 8 months time from tearing it in early December. You're talking about training camp opening up in late July, so somewhere in that like 8 plus month time range. But you've got another 6 weeks or so until the season is starting. So it would be a little quick, but it feels like if anyone is able to overcome that, it feels like someone like Daniel Jones, who is still young. He's still 28 years old. Not he a decade younger than Kirk Cousins and even more so than Aaron Rodgers, who are the quarterbacks that have dealt with this type of injury most recently. And then we also got a positive update on Javarius Ward, who, when we spoke to him at Locker Cleanout Day, the day after the season ended, told us that he was seriously contemplating retiring after the 3 concussions that he suffered throughout the 2025 season, his first season in Indianapolis. The second of those was the most severe in terms of the lingering symptoms and the amount of time that he experienced them. He talked about nausea, dizziness, just kind of being unable to go about his daily life in any level of comfort for several weeks in October and early November there before he did come back for a couple games. Chris Ballard told us that Mooney was really eager to get back and was pretty frustrated, I think, with Ballard and the doctors who ultimately, it sounds like, basically told him he needed to be out for the end of the season. They put him on IR. They only had 4 games left, and that was the end of his 2025 season in Indianapolis. But Ballard told us that Um, all indications are that Mooney Ward will be back next year with the Colts. He still has 2 years left on his deal. You hope that that he is healthy and he can just avoid concussions, because you don't want to see a guy continue to battle with those, and you also don't know what yet another one in a still fairly short period of time could mean for him and his long-term health. But that's from a football standpoint, presuming he is in a good headspace on and off the field, a great development for the Colts in an important position, and one that they had invested a lot in over the last 12 months or so. A player that I don't know that we've touched on that I do think could factor into these free agent discussions over the next couple weeks. A guy who's not a free agent right now, but who could either with a restructure or parting ways with the team could free up a significant amount of cap space, is Michael Pittman Jr. Chris Ballard was asked about him and his future with the Colts. He still has 1 year left on the deal that he signed with this team a couple years ago. Oddly enough, Michael Pittman Jr. was the player that the Colts most recently used a franchise tag on.
Because he was hunting.
Yes,
in Africa.
He was in Africa.
He's in Africa.
Ballard told us that story that they trusted they were going to be able to work something out, but he was in transit out of the country, out of the continent, and so they opted to use that a couple years ago, back in the spring of 2024. Ultimately worked out a 3-year, $70 million deal with Michael Pittman Jr. But he is someone who, if the Colts parted ways with him, would only cost the team $5 million in dead money. If he's on the roster this season, he counts $29 million against the cap. $24 million potentially they could save, bumping that cap space figure from right around $35 million where it sits right now to close to $60 million, which is not nothing when you're talking about what they need to find to be able to pay Daniel Jones and Alec Pierce. Chris Ballard didn't give us a direct answer when asked about Michael Pittman's future with the team. How did you interpret what we heard from Chris and Shane on that, and what you might expect both sides to try to accomplish over the next couple of weeks?
Yeah, I think the reality is that as much as Chris Ballard likes Pittman and wants to keep him, I do think there's a reality where that's the move they have to make in order to do some of the other things. I don't think that Shane Steichen feels that. I kind of think that Shane Steichen probably feels like there are ways to replace Pittman's production that are more difficult to replace if you're trying to replace Alec Pierce. I don't know that means that he's gone, because yes, it'd be tough to carry two receivers with, 20, two receivers who combined make something like $50-something million. But Pittman wouldn't be back next year in that scenario, So I do think that if there's a way to work it out, they could probably do that. I don't know. Someone mentioned this to me. I don't know if Pittman would be willing to do it like a restructure, because part of his deal he signed before, keeping it 3 years, was that he could cash it again with a third deal. And so I wonder what the number would have to be on a restructure or an extension to get that cap figure down for him to say yes to it. Because his value is also probably a little bit down. He probably wants to rebuild that. I think that's a complex spot. I don't think Chris Ballard wants to get rid of Michael Pittman. That makes sense because, he wasn't a difference maker last year. He wasn't a liability either. I do think, though, and Pittman said this at the end of the year, but I think he was right, that Pittman's play fell off a little bit from where we've seen it when he was catching 100 balls a year. There's just, if you're going to be the possession receiver and the guy who makes the tough contested catches, there were a couple catches down the stretch that he dropped that he had to have. And one of them was in the loss to Houston. Was it Houston or Jacksonville?
Yeah, it was the home Houston game.
Right after, the larger drop was Josh Downs, but the next play, they run a slant. The ball is a little bit high, but it's catchable. I've watched it a bunch of times. It's catchable. And like if you're going to be the $23 million receiver who's a possession receiver, you have to have that ball. And I think it's that kind of catch that he was thinking about when he was saying, at the end of the season that he has to play better, to justify what they're going to do with him. So Pittman is interesting because I do think Pierce is going to cost a lot of money.
Yeah, he also felt, and some of this time wise, I think jives with what you were talking about, where his performance dropped off a little bit in the back half of the season. I also felt like in some way, and I'd have to think a little bit longer about why this might be, but he also felt like someone whose numbers dropped off really significantly right around that time where Daniel Jones, suffered his fractured fibula.
Injured.
Yeah, he's a little inhibited for those 3 games there, and then you've got Phillip Rivers in there, who's was not putting up major numbers, just kind of trying to help the Colts not lose a game in those 3 games that he played. For comparison, Alec Pierce's numbers from an average standpoint, I think maybe dropped off a little bit. And some of that is, I think, just due to the volume. The Colts were just not throwing the ball as much over the last half of the year as they did in the first half of the year. But he was still able to pick up some big gains, as is going to happen with him. And we just weren't seeing the same type of production. I think that we had maybe 1 touchdown over the last half of the season. Alex Pierce had somewhere around 4, I want to say. And so I don't know that we would have definitively said it coming into the 2025 season, but it feels pretty clear that Alec Pierce is the Colts' #1 receiver, presuming he comes back. And you're right. I mean, you look at some of the teams that are paying upwards of $25 million a year to 2 receivers. I guess the outlier is this Eagles team from 2 years ago that won the Super Bowl, but you can connect the dots pretty easily to teams that just don't have a whole lot of money to pay elsewhere. The Bengals, the Dolphins, the Cowboys, those 3 teams have notable holes on their roster. Now, it's of course not only because of the wide receiver position, but you have to, when you're trying to balance things out, you're going to have to run a little bit cheaper in other places. And it just feels like right now where you can't keep spending 55 or close to $60 million on 2 wide receivers when you've got some notable holes that you've got to fill in with the rest.
Yeah. It's the other thing is like one of the other things that stuck out about like why what Shane said about Pierce, his first answer really didn't have anything to do with the deep ball, which is I think the thing that separates him from everything else. But Shane talked a lot about the routes he can run, the way his route trees developed, the contested catches, the in breakers. If you lost Michael Pittman and you said how are you going to replace that production? Well, one of the ways you do that is you give Alec Pierce more of a high volume role in the offense. And I think Tyler Warren's continued development, which is another thing that they talked about yesterday, is another way you replace it. I just think that they think there's probably a way to do that. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. It has been a quiet offseason for the Colts, but it is not going to be quiet really starting at the end of this week, going into free agency. There's a lot of stuff that's going to happen.
Another element to some fireworks that could be waiting to pop off here in just about any time. Anthony Richardson, another topic of conversation yesterday when we spoke with Chris Ballard, who at the end of the season, when we spoke to him in his extensive press conference, said he still, he loved Anthony. He appreciated his, his hard work, his dedication, the way he, kept his head up through a really trying 3 seasons for lots of different ways, all of them involving injuries in some form. this one, of course, this year, starting with losing the starting job to Daniel Jones in training camp, and then the unfortunate incident in the locker room where he fractured his orbital bone, had to undergo surgery, had to be rushed to the hospital. That morning when the Colts were preparing to play a home game against the Cardinals in Week 6. He was still, he's back at practice over the last couple of weeks of the regular season, but had not been cleared to return from IR as he was still dealing with vision limitations. And we came into this offseason, the Colts hadn't definitively declared that they were going to trade him, but it has all the feelings of a player who is at the end of the runway with a team who, knows that Daniel Jones, they want Daniel Jones to be their starting quarterback. It is increasingly feeling, when you read between the lines, that they believe that Riley Leonard can even be their backup quarterback, and that leaves Anthony Richardson, someone who was drafted 4th overall just 4 years ago. Are you really going to hold on to him when he could have some value in the trade market as your third quarterback? It just feels.
You also save money.
Yes, you could.
A fairly significant amount.
I think he costs somewhere around $10 million this year against the cap. Am I right that the Colts could essentially save half of that if they were to trade him? Is that
because it's the stuff that's not signing bonus.
Correct. So, a big part of that, if he would be tradable, what you could get for him in a trade would be, if those vision limitations cleared up. Chris Ballard said yesterday, and I think it ran a little bit under the radar because there was so much that was being talked about, among players that we either expect to be on the Colts roster or big names if they wouldn't be next year. But Chris Ballard said that Anthony Richardson has been cleared to return to play. My interpretation of that, from what I understand, is that if the regular season was still going on today, Anthony Richardson could play in a football game for the Colts. That was not Chris Ballard saying yesterday, reiterating that Richardson had returned to practice, but that his vision limitations, though, they are not, his vision is not where it was, the first couple of days of October before this accident happened. From what I understand, Anthony Richardson's vision in that right eye is at a level where he would be able to play football. If the Colts were in a bind, if Daniel Jones tore his Achilles tomorrow in the regular season game where the NFL was being played in February, in late February, the Colts, it sounds like, on Anthony Richardson, and that's a big deal when you think about what he could, mean in the trade market. Is he worth a 4th round pick? When you consider his injury history, along with some of the vision stuff that is still lingering from what it sounds like, I don't know if maybe you go quite that high, but it sounds like he's probably somewhere in that 4th to 5th round market, and that's not nothing for a team that has a hole to fill and is looking to build some depth on the defensive side of the ball. So that having his vision back, I think, is a big deal for this team that ultimately it feels like is likely to trade him. Chris Ballard said he still believes that Anthony Richardson has a future in this league. He wouldn't outright definitively say that Anthony Richardson would not be on the Colts roster next year, but it feels like things are trending in that direction. And the Colts, if you believe that they are hoping to or would be looking to trade him, it sounds like maybe they can get a little bit higher value than they could have a couple weeks ago.
Yeah, I think you start by asking for the Trey Lance deal. The Cowboys gave a 4th round pick for Trey Lance. I think because of the eye and because of some of the other injury history, you don't get that. You have to take a little bit lesser deal. But it doesn't feel like it just doesn't feel like there's, for the player or for the team, it doesn't feel like there's really an avenue to keep him.
I'm sure, obviously they're going to have a 3rd quarterback in camp, but you don't want that player to be costing you $10 $10 million when you're also paying Daniel Jones whatever they're going to be paying him to be able to hold on to him either via the franchise tag or a multi-year deal that they have to sign here over the next couple of days. So that's where all of that lies. It seems like when you look at teams on the market who would be in need for a quarterback, there's been a lot of talk both around Daniel Jones if he was able to somehow leave Indianapolis, that the Minnesota Vikings would be a team that is in need of a quarterback. If you watched the games that he played last season, it does not feel like J.J. McCarthy is a sure thing there in Minnesota, and Anthony Richardson could, I think, make a decent fit. A young guy who is looking to rebound, just maybe looking for a fresh system, a fresh start. And we've seen, in lots of different situations around the league over the last couple of years that sometimes, for whatever reason, not necessarily fault of anyone, the situation a young quarterback is drafted into is not necessarily the one where they are going to be able to thrive. Some of that comes down to teams' needs to insert a rookie quarterback right away, and they don't have a chance to be able to develop like in Aaron Rodgers or Jordan Love did in Green Bay. That seems like if you had to choose, would be the way that you would want to take a high draft pick quarterback, not necessarily insert them immediately in the line, but give them at least a year to learn a system to develop into an NFL level quarterback. Maybe a la Baker Mayfield or Sam Darnold or Daniel Jones, for example. Maybe that comes for Anthony Richardson, but it seems likely that come summertime that he is in a different uniform, and we'll see if he's able to challenge for a starting job elsewhere.
I think the other thing I have from yesterday, it was a long day on Tuesday because of we got both Steichen and Ballard, and then I went to the NFL Women's Forum, and I think there's just one piece. I know some of the shine for some fans came off of Carly Ursay-Gordon at the end of the season when she decided to retain Chris Ballard, and then her press conference I don't think was as forceful as some people would have liked it to be, but I thought it was interesting because Pat McAfee was monitoring the discussion, and the quote that stuck out with me was about the way she's handling things, how involved she is in monitoring the team. He said that should be the new normal for owners. And the interesting thing, I'm going to try to do this as quickly as possible because we have been potting for 57 minutes now. But I do think that part of like when I started covering NFL 10 years ago, 11 this might be 11 years ago. When I started covering the NFL 11 years ago, like the thinking and the conventional wisdom was an owner hires somebody to be the GM, they hire them to be the coach, and then they don't do anything. They just leave them alone and wait till they hire the next one, and they don't touch it at all. There's been holes punched in that pretty hard over the last couple of years. I don't know if everyone has seen this, but there was an ESPN article done by Caitlin Kaler 2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago, I can't remember for sure, that essentially suggested that these owners who don't know what they want in a football coach and don't have a finger on the pulse of what's going on can essentially be kind of run by coaching agents. They mentioned, I think the one that sticks out is the Bears, that all of their most recent hires have been one agency, one particular agent, because they don't necessarily know, the owner doesn't necessarily know what they want football wise. The counterpoint was Jeffrey Lurie with the Philadelphia Eagles, who does know what he wants. Like he has reasons he wants an offensive coach. He has reasons, like he has certain things he wants to hear from. And what Ursay-Gordon is doing, because she doesn't interfere on game day, and she doesn't, she said, I asked her about the quarterback position. She said she doesn't evaluate the quarterback position. That's not her job. What she is more concerned with is does what the coaching staff is doing and what the general managing, what the front office is doing, make sense? it's an oversimplification, but she talks a lot about alignment. Are the things that we're doing in the off season and practice leading to what we do in the game? Does your game planning during the week and your practice during the week marry with what happens in the game, or are you practicing a bunch of stuff you're not going to use? And I think that's the way to think about it if you're a Colts fan. Now, does it mean she'll make all the right decisions? No, not necessarily. Does it mean that she shouldn't have moved on from Chris Ballard? I don't know. We're going to find that out as we go. But I think what McAfee is saying as a former player, again, this isn't me. This the reason it struck me was because it's McAfee, who's a former player and he didn't have to do that panel or whatever. He could have said no. He could say, I'm busy with ESPN. But I think the thing that sticks out to me is him as a former player saying, I would like to have a owner who does know something about what's going on and have a sense of what's going on in the building and have a finger on the pulse of things rather than just being a disembodied money bank, essentially.
And I think there's a balance to that too. There's a way to kind of thread the needle between being someone who's completely disconnected, who is funding the operation but doing very little else, and someone like Jerry Jones, who of course is not only the owner but is the general manager of the Dallas Cowboys, and speaks as often, if not more frequently, than the head coach at some point in the season. Carly Ursay-Gordon is not looking to be the face of the organization. She's not looking to. I don't anticipate her holding court frequently, if almost at all, during the regular season. Quite frankly, like we would see with Jerry Jones, but that doesn't mean that she's not involved. I mean, we heard both from Chris Ballard as well as Shane Steichen at the end of the year about the meetings that they have with her every single week, and about how those meetings can go on for, probably more so in Chris Ballard's case, those meetings can go on for a couple hours at a time. This is someone who, yes, though she has been very involved behind the scenes, probably at a level that most folks, fans especially, weren't entirely aware over the last couple of years. She is someone who is still learning about not only what this position means, but what this team needs and what the people that she is empowered need to be successful, between Chris Ballard and Shane Steichen and the captains on the team. And that comes with, admittedly somewhat behind the scenes in meeting rooms and conference rooms, as well as being on the headset and just being able to listen to what is going on a game day. That comes with being somewhat, on the frame of things, you might say, and not being completely invisible. And I think it's commendable. It's been interesting to see over the past season how she tackled this job for the first time as the principal owner, along with her sisters Kaylin and Casey. And I think that development and how she tackles this role, and the way in which she takes steps as an owner over this next season will be really interesting to track as well.
Yeah, so we'll see. Like I said, I don't think we've been in kind of a loose pod schedule where we haven't been podcasting unless we have something to do. I think that's probably going to change here. Coming up, I think we'll probably be coming at you quite a bit actually as stuff happens. But yes, that's the whole thing with the combine. I know from the outside it seems like it's about the testing on the field. It's really not. The combine is really more about, from a draft perspective, the combine is really more about what's going on medically over at IU Health. In the MRI machines and as team doctors look at people. And then I think the biggest thing is this is where, like, what happens in free agency, everything, this is where the tone gets set for those things. And so that's what a lot of the talk has been about. And like I said, the tag deadline is coming up on March 3rd. So the stuff's going to have to start. There's going to have to be some dominoes that start falling pretty quickly here.
Yep. March 3rd, 4 p.m. tag deadline. So that's early next week. You've got March 9th at noon, I believe, is when legal tampering opens for free agency.
And let's be honest, like, there's no reason to call it the legal tampering period because people like we're going to write 2 stories about how they signed somebody.
Yeah.
We're going to say agreed to terms, but we all know what that means.
And those stories could come out at, it is ironic to me that you have this legal tampering window that is only allowed to start at noon on February 9th, and yet you could have some very complex, very rich deals that could be reached within like an hour of that opening up.
Sometimes it's like a minute.
Yeah. It's just like the NBA, I think, was the worst at this, and they have, I think, some form of this legal tampering stuff, if memory serves me right, though I'm not an expert on it. But it would always be so hilarious that at insert whatever hour that was supposed to start 01, you would start getting texts or seeing tweets from Shams and Woj about how this player signed for 4 years and $168 million at this team. It's like, took you a minute to negotiate spending $168 million. That's really believable. But again, the entire league, from decision makers on teams and agents and probably some instances players, have come to Indianapolis for this. Again, there are some things to do with the combine they are involved with, but a lot going on behind the scenes in coffee shops or in meeting rooms or hotel rooms that will decide a lot of what we see in the league, in particular with the Colts, for the next couple weeks. And I believe we will have a lot to talk about, a lot to write about on IndyStar.com about those pending decisions. Encourage you to check out IndyStar.com over the next couple of days. We'll still have some stories from the combine before we set our sights on the closing of that tag deadline on Tuesday, and then we'll get maybe a quick chance to catch our breaths before free agency formally opens 6 days after that. Appreciate you guys tuning in to the Colts Cover-2 podcast. Please like and subscribe on whatever podcast platform you choose. Hope you guys are interacting with us as well on YouTube. Not only are our video podcasts posted along with some short clips, but clips as well from Shane Steichen and Chris Ballard, who we spoke to yesterday. If you need to catch up on those interviews, it's a great place to do it. For now, I'm Nathan Brown. He's Joel A. Erickson. Thanks for listening to this edition of the Colts Podcast.